Hello, everyone. So, we're going to be talking to you guys about ministering to Colombia. We both did our papers on Colombia. And so, basically, the way we're going to go about presenting this is by walking you through the cultural dimensions after giving you a brief overview. And then we'll also relate each dimension to how it's important to minister the gospel to the Colombians. Yeah, so that's what we'll be doing this presentation on. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, we're just going to go over a quick little few key ideas here about Colombia. First of all, first and foremost, they're Catholic. This is pretty key, and you see that in pretty much everywhere in Colombia, even in the rural communities. This obviously dates back to when the Spanish came over uh, and the Colombia was under Spanish rule there for a bit. But so it dates back to that. But because of how heavily Catholic they are, this can make sharing the gospel both easier and more difficult, depending on how strictly they hold to their Catholic views. But it also opens the door up a little bit because they all have that brief idea and notion of Catholicism already deeply rooted in their heritage. So it's easier to talk to them about Jesus because, well, they already know who Jesus is, right? So, and then the second thing we see is the collectivistic. Obviously, we'll go more into depth about this in the cultural dimensions, especially with traditional as well. But you see this quite a bit too. There are more people-oriented culture. Here in the U.S., it's a lot more individualized. So individualism is king here. But in Colombia, the in groups is really important. So you'll see that a lot, and we'll go over it later in the presentation as well. The third thing we see here is traditional. This is again goes back to their long-term orientation. We're going to walk you through that too. But this also is directly connected with the Catholicism, right? Because of how highly they hold their Catholicism roots, they're very traditional as well. So they anything against tradition is probably going to be met with hostility. So yeah, so obviously that's just stuff to keep in mind. Very vibrant culture. They do have celebrations and stuff, which is really cool. Second largest celebration in the world. Uh, Obviously, the one in Brazil is the largest, right? But they do have a second largest. I forget the name, but I could look it up later. And then they're a very high context culture, which kind of goes with their the vibrancy found in Colombia, right? Lots more underlying themes and things like that. And so now Aubrey here is going to be talking a little bit more about the cultural dimensions and overview for it.
Yeah, so just a brief thing before we go into the cultural dimensions. When we're sharing the gospel with any sort of culture that is different than from ours, even if like our culture seems to be similar, we still need to understand like what makes us different from them, what makes us similar, just so we're aware of like how the things we say are going to come across. So before ministering cross culturally, it's really important to understand what our differences are and how to best share the gospel with them. It's just overall. So on the next slide, we have like a graph here. Yeah, so we've got a graph here about each cultural dimension and how they rate compared with the United States. So as you see, the blue, yeah, is the United States, and then on the left we have the orange is Colombia, and that just shows how Colombia rates, and it gives a good comparison on each dimension for that. So we have power distance. As you can see, Colombia rates pretty high on that. Individualism, motivation towards achievement and success, uncertainty avoidance, which is very, very high. And the next two are really interesting because they really go hand in hand, which is long-term orientation and indulgence. You can really see on the long-term orientation that Colombia is extremely low on that, which directly relates on how high their indulgence level is. So that's just a brief overview of the cultural dimensions. Cultural dimensions really is just each category of are able to understand the way that this culture like genuinely works. Obviously, there's going to be differences in each individual in their culture, but as a general overview, these are the themes that we're going to be seeing from like city to city, tribe to tribe, like things like that.
Yeah. So the first dimension that we're going to be talking about is the power distance. So obviously Colombia has a pretty high power distance, right, of 67, and that's reflected in the culture. You can see that when you just talk to Colombians day to day. I actually have an aunt in Colombia right now who's a missionary, so it's kind of cool to be able to see that. I hopefully am able to go down and visit her one of these years, but we'll see. But yeah, you can really see this reflected in the culture, just in the day-to-day conversations. Most people feel like they are stuck where they're at. It's a very the poverty is that if you're in poverty, you're most likely to stay in poverty, and that's because of the high power distance, right? Most people just generally accept, right? The status is accepted socially that they're going to be in a lower class of life. So if you're in the middle class, they're just going to accept the fact that, oh, I'm in the middle class and I'm not going to be able to work up to that. And this is really important when we share the gospel to them because it can give them for those that are lower in class, it can give them hope, because if they have this feeling of being stuck at the bottom, and it is generally accepted, then it can be hard for them as individuals because they may not have that hope that is in Jesus Christ, right? And how they have something to look forward to in the future. And then as conversely, when they're in the higher classes, when you share Christ with them, you can share about how, hey, you need to be a little bit more considerate of those around you, maybe uh, help those that are beneath you, and just like Christ did, and how he humbled himself, right? And so you can use those kinds of principles to relate to the people here in Colombia based on the cultural dimension of power distance, right? So, and then next, we are going to be talking about the collectivism.
Yeah, collectivism is part of the identity cultural dimension. And so Colombia is known as like being very high on the collectivist scale, as you can see, is pretty low on individualism. It affects every aspect of their lives. As you can see, collectivism is a huge part and kind of connects to all the other cultural dimensions as well. They're really focused on group orientation. They're like specific in groups. They value harmony a lot more than confrontation. Like they have a very, very low confrontation style. When we're ministering to collectivist cultures, it's really important to redirect their focus from their in group to that of like the whole body of Christ. As we see in Christianity, like there are so many passages in the scripture and so many books that talk about the importance of unity in Christ and unity in the body. It talks about like the body of the church, things like that. Like Ephesians is I really a big book that talks about like um, our new creation in Christ and how we are to be then one in Christ, unity in the church, things like that. So collectivism plays a really huge part of that.
And you can actually see a little bit of the in groups in the Colombian society just based on obviously friend groups and social circles, but then also gang and crime violence is pretty
Mhm.
prevalent in Colombia. If you're talking to Colombians, don't just mention crime like, oh, wow, it's so crime filled down there, because they tend to take that hos they tend to take that negatively. But
Yeah.
it is reflected in that too. Like there is a lot of people wanting to be associated with gangs for protection, because sometimes that can happen too. So you do see a lot of those in groups there. And yeah, Aubrey is right. We need to pay attention to that when it comes to ministering and ministering Christ to them. Next, we have the motivation. Obviously, I mean, motivation, gender, whichever you want to call it. Uh, Obviously, we're very similar, the US here. And this is actually kind of based a lot of the same we do have a lot of the same traditional things that Colombians do, maybe because we have a similar religion base, but yeah, it goes all hand in hand. So obviously masculine in practice, right? We see a lot of traditional roles in both in the household and in the business circles. Um, and what I mean by traditional, I mean like man providing the food, the money for the house, while the woman is kind of like the head of the household per se, when where she takes care of the house and the children. It's not uncommon to see women working in higher up roles too. That is something that can be, but it is a little bit more rare, and so that's why they score 64 rather than like an 80. Um, and so yeah, and then you also see the hierarchical roles in business, just everyone addressing as the formal usted, right? And in business circles, if someone's above you, you've got to respect that, and they can boss you around and whatnot. And that's also reflected in the in-group and social circles, like we were just talking about. Um, those in groups, if one is in a higher socially, obviously there's going to be a little bit of conflict there, but ultimately, like they actually have more power, and it's viewed that way. And so we need to be talking for this one. It was hard for me to come up with some sort of principle for it, but we do need to be careful when talking about the roles of men and women in the church, because sometimes it can be confusing as to who's got what role. And obviously, we need to be careful about it here in the U.S. But as you can see, we do have similar scores on our motivation scale. So when we are talking about those roles, it's important to be careful with that. But then also, talking about the role that Christ played in society and how he again humbled himself to minister to those around him, and that can be something, especially for those in a higher role, that can be something that's hard for them to grasp as a concept. So
Mhm.
again, being careful about that.
Yeah, and I know we like mentioned something like this before, but on the traditional sales, though that would be the uncertainty avoidance cultural dimension, you can see that Colombia is extremely high, scoring an 80, with the US right next to it being a 46. It's a really very large difference there. Therefore, that means that the that would be like Colombian being a very high uncertainty avoidance culture. So therefore, the values there are a lot more traditional, as you can see in the Catholicism that's very, very prevalent in the nation. It's a lot more formal. Procedure is really valued. Change is like constantly avoided. So it's Catholicism. It's not very much of an individual choice. It's more heavily followed in like it really integrated into like family relations. It's as I said, it's a more of a way of living than an individual decision. It's not it's more kind of something that you would inherit. So it's basically something that you just accept that you would follow, because thinking of changing that is kind of unheard of. Thinking of like how before like changes really heavily avoided in this cultural dimension. And so I said with the ministering aspect of that, it's probably better to take the longer path of this and try to build trust and relationships over time. Um, it would be kind of difficult to jump in immediately and expect someone to just completely change their point of view. And uh, so it would be a little bit more helpful for them to do a long-term building trust, just so we can have slowly help them change their traditions and views towards Christianity focused values instead of Catholicism.
Yeah. And then also ministering to them in their tradition too. Obviously,
Mhm.
Catholicism and Christianity have a very similar base understanding of Jesus Christ and what he came to do for us here on earth. And so going into that, that verse Paul says, I've become all things to all things, right? So again, ministering in the tradition can also be very helpful in that. And so obviously the last one, I just kind of grouped it together as time management, because that's kind of how it works, I feel. Obviously, long-term orientation and indulgence are very, very similar in practice, right? So Colombia has a very, very low scale of 6. They don't really plan anything for the future except maybe their celebration. But that's kind of it. Like they don't have savings, kind of. They just keep it all very very the here and now is what's going on. And this is also reflected in that indulgent culture, right? Uh, I think they take a lot of the indulgent culture from the US where they are as consumerism is very very high. You'll often see like markets and people just trying to sell everything that they can just to make a living for that day, right? And so that's kind of reflected in the goods and services, right? And so when sharing Christ, we got to reflect that his work is a permanent change and not temporary. And I say this because as a very short-term oriented country, if we tell them if they do accept Christ, they need to know that this has a lasting impact for the future and not just something that's going to be staying in the here and now, right? Uh, for yeah, especially for Colombians, that's something that might be a little bit harder for them to grasp because they don't really, like I said, plan for the future too much. And so that's just kind of how this dimension relates to that. Anything else to add to that last dimension there?
Not like, but yeah, I think the other thing is like the indulgence aspect of it too, just being so high on that. It just kind of really shows the culture of how even if they were a little bit more like long-term orientation, like they could still have a higher indulgence, but it's really seen that like they really like are very vibrant culture. They love their tradition, they love their celebrations. And I think we can like really like push that into showing them how it's important to be making sacrifices for Christ. If I think that would be more in like the discipleship side of like ministering to the people. But yeah, that just might also play a time in it. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And concluding slide.
Yeah, just wrapping everything together. As I wrote down here, it's just so incredibly important when sharing cross-cultural ministry to understand how knowledge, consideration, and commitment are the most necessary aspects to effectively minister to other nations because you all need to have all three in order to effectively share because if you just have the knowledge and you don't have any sort of compassion or consideration for the other culture you're not going to really be able to help them or if you have lots of passion but no knowledge about the culture and no commitment it's not going to work either it's really important to tie all these in together to really do your best to fulfill the Great Commission as Christ ordered us
Yeah,
to.
absolutely. Obviously, there's a lot of things that you need to consider when you're ministering cross-culturally. And so there are a lot of things that can carry over. But for Colombians especially, I would say focus on that tradition. You know, they're very deep set in that. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for listening. And hopefully we'll see you in class later. All right, thanks.